Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Matt from Matt's Bookshelf, and today I am sitting on the floor because it's a very special episode of my channel, and that is my official 2022 bookshelf video. I've never done one of these videos before, but I thought now would be the perfect time to show off most of the books that I have and give an idea of what I've already read and what I'll be reading in the future. So with that said, let's get into the bookshelf tour. Stop. First, I have the series of books that arguably made me as a reader and as a writer today, and that is the Song of Ice and Fire series. I don't own A Game of Thrones, actually. I've read it twice. First time I borrowed it from a friend. Second time I read it at my high school's library, because during recess I had nothing else to do but to read. And I've talked about these before, but these are probably the most influential books for me as a writer, and probably as a reader as well. This is really the first series that I obsessed over. George R. Martin is the first author where I ever endeavored to find out his backstory and what his life experiences, how they would have affected the books, his themes, and all that kind of stuff, all the sort of literary analysis that I do now for this channel. And yeah, I really owe a lot of who I am and what I look for in fiction due to this series, and I can't recommend them enough if you haven't read them. I know that my channel is mostly revolved around classics, but in my opinion, The Song of Ice and Fire sticks out with the best of the best of fiction, and I would highly recommend reading it, even if you're not typically a fan of fantasy. I also have The Stories of the Sahara by Sen Mao. Sen Mao was a Taiwanese woman who traveled the world. She lived in Spain, she lived in the US, and she lived all over Europe and Asia. And she's a very influential figure for women in Asia because living in the 1900s, she faced a lot of adversity. She managed to defy all the stereotypes at the time and live independently, live her own life, and see the world, which is something that most people did not do at that time period. And this collection of short stories, collection of real-life stories, takes place in the Spanish Sahara, which was a very dangerous place to live in because it's a very cut-off society, and they live very far away from the government, so disease, war, can occur, and the government can't intervene at all with it, and they're a very superstitious culture as well. And it's just about Senmoa dealing with this culture. For example, there's a time where people are getting sick, but their religion makes it so they typically don't trust medicine, but she gives them medicine, and they think that she's this great healer. And there's another story where she's out with her husband in the middle of the desert, and he gets caught in quicksand, and she encounters a bunch of men who she thinks will help her, but end up trying to attack her, and she has to escape, which she luckily manages to escape, and then save her husband. These stories are larger than life in many ways, but I tend to believe that they are true because, it was such an isolated society, and it's almost like what I would think of being the Wild West in the U.S., so it's definitely an excellent collection of stories. This is actually the first of her collection of stories that is published in English. They have been published all over the world in many different languages, but this is the first time it's ever been published in English. And if you like to travel, if you like travel stories, I'd recommend The Stories of Sen Mao. Next, I have two medieval history books. The first being The Plantagenets by Dan Jones, and the second being The Black Prince by Michael Jones. So, The Plantagenets follows the Plantagenet dynasty in England up to the War of the Roses. Dan Jones also has a book about the War of the Roses, which I read, and I could not find for some reason in my house, but that was the first medieval history book that I read, and it's incredible, so I read The Plantagenets as well. I would actually recommend reading War of the Roses first, even though chronologically it happens after this book, because it covers a much shorter period of time, and this book, although excellent, covers a larger period of time and a lot more kings, so it's a little harder to get into if this is your first time around with British monarchy. But Dan Jones manages to consistently write in a very approachable style, even for someone like me, who doesn't have too much experience with the genre. And I recommend that if you were trying to get into British history, specifically the medieval Plantagenet history, because, man, speaking of A Song of Ice and Fire, that's what The Song of Ice and Fire is mostly inspired by, the War of the Roses. And if you think The Song of Ice and Fire is great, the real-life counterpart is just as crazy, in my opinion. And then with The Black Prince by Michael Jones, it focuses more on one character, that being the Black Prince of Wales, Edward, and his time as he went to war alongside his father to France, and all of the epic battles that you know about today took place, and his tragic death before his father. He was set up to be the King of England but dysentery, it'll do it to most of the Plantagenets, got to him, and unfortunately he passed away too early, but it's a very fascinating book and a very interesting look at the man's life. And I also have The Civil War by Julius Caesar. This is my first time actually reading a book by Julius Caesar. I read it earlier this year. My first video ever is on it, so if you want my full thoughts on this book, watch that video. But, I mean, I love ancient Rome, as you can tell. I love history, and this is a must-read if you are fascinated in the genre. Next up, we're going to the Jazz Age with my collection of F. Scott Fitzgerald. I have The Great Gatsby, The Beautiful and the Damned, This Side of Paradise, and what I'm currently reading, Tender is the Night. And like George R. R. Martin, I kind of owe a lot of who I am today as a reader to F. Scott Fitzgerald. 2 years ago, right at the start of the pandemic, I picked up The Beautiful and the Damned, just on the whim. I read Great Gatsby in high school, I liked it, but I was looking for something different, so I picked this book up, and it basically ignited my rediscovering love for the classics, and I owe this book so much. It's one of my favorite books of all time. I recommend this more than any of his other works so far, but, I mean, it's F. Scott Fitzgerald. There's a certain level of excellence you have with these books, and I'm currently loving Tender is the Night. This Side of Paradise is the only one that I'm kind of mixed on. I'm not particularly crazy about this book, but you might find enjoyment out of it. And you can't talk about F. Scott Fitzgerald without talking about Ernest Hemingway. I have For Whom the Bell Tolls, which I just finished reading, because I went to Spain in November, and I wanted to read a book about Spain, and so I read For Whom the Bell Tolls. I have Sun Also Rises, which is also about Spain, but I read this earlier in the year, and I have Movable Feast. I will say that I tend to enjoy Hemingway in smaller pieces. I love The Sun Also Rises, and this book's incredible. I moderately enjoyed Movable Feast, which actually belongs to my friend Mark, who knows Lorenzo. I've got to give it back to him at some point. And From the Bell Tolls is good, in my opinion. It's very long, though, and it goes past the point of... It's about, I would even say it's about 100 pages too long, to be honest, but Sun Also Rises is a masterpiece, in my opinion, and as someone who loves to travel and loves to write, I heavily relate to the book. And I also have Guy de Maupassant's collection of short stories. I read this earlier in the year, and it's very good. There are some very tragic short stories, and there are some very funny short stories. And I've been told that Guy de Maupassant, I've been told that F. Scott Fitzgerald was heavily inspired by Guy de Maupassant, so I picked it up. And I'd say it's worth it if you want to get into short stories. This is really my first short story collection that I read all the way through. And it was really good. I recommend it. Now I have Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman. I read this because I played the God of War game, and I wanted to learn more about Norse mythology. And although I think Neil Gaiman wrote the worst book ever in American Gods, this book is actually pretty good. Othello by this author named Bill Shakespeare. William Shakespeare. I'm sorry. This is my only Shakespeare that I own. I've read a lot of Shakespeare, though, but this is the only one that I have currently. I really like Othello. It's very good. W.E.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folk. This was a very interesting read for me, because I read it in university, I think sophomore year, and when you learn American history, at least in my school, in elementary school, you have the Civil War, and then they just jump 100 years to the Civil Rights Movement, and they completely go over anything that happened. Well, no, they talk about World War II as well, but they kind of go over like what happens in America specifically from Civil War, cuts right to Civil Rights Movement, and Souls of Black Folk goes into in depth as to the integration process of taking former slaves, bringing them into society as free people, and how much the U.S. government completely blundered it. And this is a great book. I would highly recommend it if you want to learn more about this time period, if you're like me, and when you're in school, in elementary school, that completely blew by this period of time. Wilkie Collins' The Moonstone. This is a great, I think the first ever mystery novel. It probably isn't true, but it's one of the first. Wilkie Collins was a pioneer of something with this book, and it is incredible. I read this almost 4 years ago, and I still remember a lot of the minute details of this book, and it's really good. I recommend it. Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. My hot takes video is already out there for you to watch if you want to get my full thoughts on it. But yeah, watch the video. Clockwork Orange and The Wanting Seed is part of my House of Burgess read-along, where I read more Burgess works, which I'll get to talking about this book at some point. But, Clockwork Orange is a masterpiece. I've read it twice now. You can watch my video on it. And I do really enjoy this book as well. I just got to get around to making a video about it. The Leopard by Giuseppe Tomasi de Lampedusa. As an Italian American, I really wanted to read some more Italian literature, and this is the one that was largely recommended. I have a video on this book as well. It's mostly non-spoiler. I think the video is pretty good, to be honest, and if you're interested in the book, I recommend watching the video, but this is to give a brief analysis, to give a brief summary of my thoughts. This is one of the best books I read last year. Highly, highly recommend it. It's phenomenal. It's a shame that Giuseppe only wrote one novel because, man, he could have accomplished so much more. H.P. Lovecraft's Great Tales of Horror. I've read a couple of these. They're very good. I gotta get back into reading this more. Blood of Elves, the Witcher book. I read The Last Wish 6 years ago. I read this book 3 years ago. They are very good fantasy, in my opinion. Fatherland by Robert Harris. This, I think, is probably one of the most underrated books of our generation. Came out in the 90s, but it's, recent compared to, the grand scope of literature. I read this book twice, actually, and it's a speculative fiction as to what would have happened if the Nazis had won World War II, and much in the vein of Man in the High Castle, but I like this book a lot more. It follows a detective in Berlin in the 1960s as he investigates the murder of a high-ranking SS officer, and the book has a lot of great twists and turns. It's very well detailed in what German society would look like at this time had the Nazis won, and has some great characters as well, and a really engaging plot. And even though I've read it twice, I enjoyed it just as much as second read. I would really, really recommend this book. I will probably do a video on it someday when I reread it, but for a third time. But as it stands right now, I'm just going to recommend it here. Next we have my claim to fame, my magnum opus of collections of literature, and that is my James Joyce collection. And I have Joyce and Padua, which are his essays in Italian when he was trying to apply to an English teaching school in Trieste. I have Giacomo Joyce, which I never heard of. I have Exiles, which is his only play. I have Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is phenomenal. And I have maybe my favorite book of all time, Ulysses. If you have been on my channel before, you know that I've already talked about these books. You know my thoughts on James Joyce, and spending last year reading all of his works in my Road to Ulysses series was one of the greatest reading experiences, if not the greatest reading experience of my life. And speaking of Irish writers, I have The Spinning Heart, which is a collection of stories in Ireland, written by one author, but it's very good. And I have Dark Lies the Island by Kevin Barry, who is a famous modern Irish writer. He's only in his early 40s as far as I'm aware, and I actually read some of his short stories in an Irish literature class I took at my university at home. And then when I went for my Erasmus program at University College Dublin, we had to read the books again and the short stories again. And Kevin Barry actually showed up at one of my classes to read his short story, If You Were to Kill Her, out loud. And the man is, first of all, he's very likable. Second of all, he basically put on a one-man play of the book as he's reading it. He really has a master of character work, and he said that when he writes books, he will act out the books out loud to get a better idea of how well the prose is flowing and how well the characters are portrayed. And watching him act out If You Were to Kill Her, a short story, in front of a huge auditorium of students was absolutely amazing, because you can just feel the passion in what he's doing. And as a writer, that sort of method has been really inspiring to me as to how to make character voices distinct, how to make your own narrative voice distinct. He is definitely a master of that, and I really recommend this collection of short stories because it's very, very good. Next, I have Richard Brautigan's The Hawkline Monster. One of my favorite film directors, Yorgos Lanthimos, is making a movie on this book, so I read it a while ago. It's a gothic western, and it's very interesting. The New Oxford Book of English Verse, a collection of poetry, and I read this every once in a while. I started reading this 6 months ago. I pick it up every once in a while. It's very good, but obviously I have way more I need to read for this. Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. This is part of my odyssey in reading more books by female authors, because I severely lacked in that last year. And this is recommended to me by a friend. It follows the last ever woman executed in Iceland, and it's supposed to be like a psychological drama in a way, and I'm really looking forward to reading this probably next month. Next up is Jean Le Carre, The Spy Who Came from the Cold. This was recommended to me by the booktuber Book Time with Ryan. He did a really excellent video on Jean Le Carre recently, and his enthusiasm really captivated me. So I was like, oh, maybe I should try to read some Jean Le Carre, and I messaged him, and he recommended me this book. So thank you for your recommendation. I will probably be getting around to this book sometime soon. Ben-Hur. I have not read this book or seen the movie, so at some point I will do that. But I went to a used bookstore and found this very, very cheap. It has some really amazing illustrations on the inside and like all over, really. I'm really excited to read this at some point, but I don't know when. The Holly Bible. I've never heard of this before. It was just on my bookshelf. Might be good. I don't know. Edgar Allan Poe's collection of short stories. This is what my friend Mark gave me for my birthday. Thank you, Mark, or Junzo, as you know him. This is very beautiful. I've read a couple short stories already, but I'm kind of weird with short stories, as you can tell with my Lovecraft collection as well. I just kind of pick them up randomly and read some and then put it back down. But this I want to save for a time where I can really dedicate a lot of time to just reading consistently, because Edgar Allan Poe is one of my favorite writers, and I mean, he's incredible. Suetonius' Life of the 12 Caesars. I'm reading this because Drunzo and I are going to do a video on it at some point. I love Roman history, and this is excellent. My James Clavell books, Shogun being one of the best books I read ever. Forever, probably. And The Noble House, I read earlier last year, is also very excellent. This man is a master of making huge, elaborate plots with tons of different, unique characters in Asian settings that, from what I've been told, are very, very culturally accurate because he spent a lot of time in China and in Japan. So, James Clavell is amazing. I highly recommend his books, especially Shogun. Hypatia by Edward J. Watts, one of a very important Alexandrian philosopher during the late Roman Empire. Very interesting book that I talk about a bit in my 2021 reading accomplishments video. So yes, watch that video if you want to get my full thoughts, but this is very good. The Odyssey, arguably the first book I actually tried to read on a critical analysis level. And I mean, it's the Odyssey. I've read it twice now. I reread it last year from my Ulysses series. I can't really say anything about it that hasn't already been said. Gone with the Wind. This is actually my uncle's house, and when we were clearing out his house, I found this, and I've never read Gone with the Wind, but I couldn't get rid of this, seeing how beautiful this book is. Like, I mean, it's just incredible. I wonder if this is actually worth a lot of money. I don't know, but I want to keep it regardless. I mean, look at these illustrations. This is amazing. This is so cool. I'm gonna read this at some point. Just, I don't know when. Wuthering Heights. I just bought this yesterday. This has been a book I've been meaning to read for a long time. So I love Victorian novels, and I will get to this hopefully soon. This is, again, also on my quest to reading more female authors. Franz Kafka's The Castle. Haven't read it yet, but I love the Metamorphosis. Sneaky James Joyce trying to hide from me. Dubliners. This is Tyler's Colorless Wonderlands. Gotta give back to him, but this is also excellent. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. Again, I just did a video on this. This is one of the best books I've read last year, and it's still on my mind. Watch my video if you want my full thoughts on it, but it's incredible. Joe Abercrombie's The Blade Itself. I don't usually read fantasy other than if it's from George R. R. Martin, but after finishing Ulysses and all the James Joyce works, I was like, I gotta read something that's not James Joyce. So I picked this up. It's a pretty light read, but I really enjoyed it. I'm probably gonna read the other books in the series as well at some point, but I think when I'm trying to take rest periods between like difficult classics, I'll probably go back to one of these books. But this is actually really good. The character work in this book is really, really well done. Just it has some unnecessary action scenes, I think, in my opinion, and some of the world building is a bit underbaked. But again, this is his first novel, and for a first time out, it's really, really good. A book I'm currently rereading right now, The Hobbit, part of a book club I'm in, and I am about a quarter of the way through. It's really good. I read it like 8 years ago, and it's nice to revisit it now because a lot of it was lost on me. Early Irish myths and sagas. I got this with my friend Mark, and he told me to buy it, so I bought it. It's really good. I'm not the biggest fan on mythologies, but I enjoyed this for the most part. The Memory Police, the worst book I have on my bookshelf. This actually belongs to Tyler. It's not good. It got compared to Fahrenheit 451. People say it's like the next Fahrenheit 451. I disagree completely. This book is not very good. Ovid's Metamorphoses. Again, it's mythos. I've been told that the Latin is much better. It's, like the English doesn't captivate nearly as much as the Latin gets across, but again, I'm not the biggest fan of mythology. I enjoyed it for what it was, but a lot of people turn to trees in this this mythology. Virginia Woolf's The Lighthouse. I'm really excited to read this at some point. I read a passage of Virginia Woolf on Ulysses, and although she does not like Ulysses, the prose was amazing. So it's like, I gotta buy some Virginia Woolf books. So I bought this one, and I'm really excited to read it at some point. The abridged version of The Decline and Fall of Ancient Rome, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's really big. So that was my bookshelf tour. I hope you enjoyed the video. Check out my other videos if you want to. Let me know which of the books I talked about that you want me to talk about later in the future that I haven't already read, or maybe books I have read that you want to hear my thoughts on. And obviously book recommendations are also encouraged because I love to read. I love to read a wide variety of books, if you cannot tell from my bookshelf. And yeah, thank you. Check out my friends Carlos Wonderland and Drunzo. They start making videos again. And yeah, so everything is good in our little booktube community. So thank you so much and goodbye.